and welcome to Wait, It Gets Better, the improvisational storytelling podcast. We record stories for you. You deliver us precious, precious creme brulee. I'm, of course, Levi.
I'm Reed.
And I'm Seth.
And we are here to take your creme brulee and tell you a story. Not this week. This week we are doing a recap of A City Between. What is your guys' first impression of this story?
Well, I think it's a good story, but it's kind of a little bit dark.
Yeah, it definitely is a bit I think we referenced 1984, and 1984 is a depressing story.
Right?
Yeah.
But we should start with people's ratings. Reed, what's your rating? 1 to 10?
4.8.
Okay. My rating it's probably a 3.5. It's a very good story and concept, but I felt like I got kind of down after reading it. I got kind of sad after making it, and I was never able to kind of bring it back. There were a lot of really cool ideas and a lot of really cool concepts, and I think maybe I would read this story, but it's difficult reading stories with like sad endings or possible sad endings or kind of no real resolution endings, and that's what I feel like this story was. How about you, Seth?
I would probably rate it a 4. I was debating on 5 to at least put it, midway, but I don't know. I think there's a lot of good ideas. I like it.
Yeah.
But I think as far as, unless it was cleaned up a lot.
Right. Maybe that's what it was. Is it like the content, the ideas were probably a 5 or a 6, but our execution kind of was closer to a 2, so it sort of drug it down to a 3 for me.
Yeah. No, I mean, I like the 1984 as depressing as it is. Like, I like that concept brought into it for this story, but I think just too many of the concepts in there probably are going in not jointed directions.
Right.
And so it like makes for a lot of things, but a nice twist at the end, but not, I don't know. I like it. Again, like I said, I think if it was cleaned up, I would probably put it somewhere in like the 5 point something to 6 range.
Right. What's another book, Reed or Seth, that you guys have read that has done, besides 1984, the kind of desperate, dystopian, kind of allegorical story well? Can you guys think of any? My first thought as I was saying this was Animal Farm, but that's another Orwell book, so I wouldn't necessarily count that. But then my third thought was Lord of Flies.
Yeah.
Which I thought was done really well.
Really well also, but it's depressing. And it's it was really a good story.
Yeah, I guess nothing directly comes to mind. I mean, mention those, but I can't think of anything else off the top of my head that I've read that's in that same vein. I'm pretty sure like there's something that I've read, or watched as far as story wise.
There's a couple of
It'd be something like that, but
a couple of stories that came to mind that have kind of a twist. They take that just depressing thing, but they take that twist at the end.
Yeah.
And Fahrenheit 451.
Right.
Where it is like, all that is the idea of the firemen, their job was to find hidden caches of books and go and burn them, and then you had, well, I'm not going to, spoiler alert, if you haven't read Fahrenheit 451, just turn this off because you need to read it clean.
And then come back.
Just in a couple of seconds. Fahrenheit 451 were the book people, where they literally their identity would become a book. And there's this scene where this young lad has been grilled by this old guy, and he's memorizing. I believe it might have been a Dickens novel. I can't remember, but it was. And then the old man dies, and the kid is reciting it. And the part that always gave him trouble, he just went through it just clean and smooth, and he had this big grin on his face, and it was just really rich. Another one that comes to mind is Book of Eli.
Oh yeah,
which is on a similar vein, to that. Levi, you brought up a book that I told you about. And if you're back, I'm going to have another spoiler alert here. One of my favorite genres is historical fiction. And it's difficult to do because it requires a lot of research. It requires a lot of research to to just make sure that you've got the historical setting right.
Right.
And then you drop your fictional characters into like events that actually happened. Like, for example, Sharp's Rifles was a series. He wrote these books, and it was put out on a PBS miniseries. And it's during the Napoleonic era. And Sharp was a British soldier, and he was a rifleman, which they were shooting muskets back then, and they would have this newfangled rifle, which is much more accurate out to a longer distance. And he and his crew were like skirmishers, and they would go out and raise all kinds of heck and mayhem. But anyway, I always loved that he got his history right, and events and battles that actually took place, and his characters were believable as part of an actual historical event. Well, you brought up one of my very favorite of this genre is Leon Uris. He is a guy that wrote his first novel was called Battle Cry, and it was kind of autobiographical. It was a story about a bunch of guys that responded to Pearl Harbor and joined the Marines, and that goes through, boot camp and the whole thing. And I don't know how the Marines worked in World War II. I don't know, but these guys like stuck together and were in the same outfit, and they, after training, that got shipped out to New Zealand where they just had more training. And finally, the rumor mill, the scuttlebutt was always abounding that they were going to go, deploy so and so or somewhere. Well, they ended up going to Guadalcanal, ended up hitting the beach at Tarawa, Saipan, and finally Iwo Jima. And it was really historically clean. I mean, as far as being a story plausibly about people who were actually there. And the truth was, this guy was actually there, and he wrote about his experiences as a Marine. And
how did I bring this up?
Well, you brought it up in regard to Mila 18, and that was the story about the Jewish ghetto in Warsaw.
Oh yeah, right.
Yeah, and it was what they did is the Nazis forced people to relocate into compounds that they had, they could barricade, and they had controllable entry access points, put it that way. And then they would show up in the morning with their trucks, and they would haul the laborers off to work all day and then bring them back and stuff. And it was just a mechanism that they used to control undesirable populations. Well, then at a certain point, as things started going badly for the Nazis, they just decided to exterminate the Warsaw Ghetto. And they went in there, but they had somehow smuggled weapons in. They stopped feeding them, for one thing. And then they didn't realize that they had were sending foraging parties out through the sewers so they could emerge in other parts of the city and get supplies and bring back, and then steal weapons and get back. And then they went in to exterminate them, and they just had a bloody battle on their hands. So they just used artillery and just pounded the Warsaw Ghetto into rubble. And then they went in, and they were fighting in the basements, and they had knocked out walls, between buildings so that they were literally fighting house to house, but in the sub level. So the next time they came back with more men, and they had some ambushes set up, but the guys would just disappear. And then they found out they'd gone a level below, and they had taken up residence in the sewers a level below the basements, and they were fighting and doing battle. And the story was written from the perspective of this journalist who was writing careful notes. He was writing his journal about all the events that had taken place and all this. And then they finally realized that they're just going to come and exterminate them, but they decided, they weren't going to surrender. They were going to fight to the last man. And they had a meeting, and they said to the hero, "You've got to get your manuscript out. The story has to be told." And so they're coming in to exterminate them, and they've got ambush points set up. Well, they'd fight and do damage, and then they would retreat to the next checkpoint, and they'd set up another ambush, and they were fighting house to house, 2 levels below the street level, fighting to the last man, holding a stronghold and just taking as many enemies with them as they could. And all this while, this guy is trying to make his way out of the city through the sewers. And he finally gets away with his carefully wrapped and protected manuscript. And then when I read it, it just all of a sudden it dawned on me. This happened. This story really happened. And we wouldn't know about it. Without this, these people sold their lives so that the story wouldn't die, so that they wouldn't be just butchered in total anonymity. They fought to the last man, woman, and child for one guy to get out and get it published. And here's I was sitting there holding this book and my hands were shaking because this story really happened in real time in World War II, Warsaw, and and that's, and you reference that because I know I had told you this story before.
Yeah.
And anyway, Leon Uris, Uris. Anything he's written is worth reading. They did a big movie back in the '60s out of one of his books called Exodus. And I think it was definitely the best song in the Academy Awards. And I know it was up for Best Picture. And I didn't look it up. I don't know if it won, but I know it was up for Best Picture. But it was a great movie. Interestingly enough, it was Paul Newman played the lead character. Anyway, it was a worthy movie to watch, but it was also a good book to watch, good book to read. Another book he wrote, which is a must read, and as far as I'm concerned, it's called The Hajj, story about from the pre-World War II, leading up to the formation of the State of Israel from the perspective of the leader of a clan of Arabs that lived in what is now West Bank. Anyway, it's just this guy writes really good historical fiction, so he's worth reading. Topaz is a great one about the Cuban Missile Crisis. Several of his books they're all worth reading. Sorry, I kind of went on and on, but it's kind of a thing of mine.
That's okay. One of my pieces of inspiration was there was this Twilight Zone episode where there were these two warring the humans and the aliens, and they were out on the humans were out on patrol. This is how I'm trying to remember exactly how the episode went. They were out on patrol and they had to be constantly taking this drug, which was like radiation and anti-poison drug. And one of the characters, this whole episode sort of takes place in a single room, which is so interesting. It's one of the reasons I love Twilight Zone so much. But his machine breaks, and after they've captured one of the quote-unquote aliens, and slowly as his sort of medication machine breaks, slowly the alien starts looking more and more human. And what they realize is that the countries have talked to each other and agreed that war is best. And so they literally take a drug to trick their soldiers into thinking that they're fighting aliens. And each side thinks that they're the humans, or is the humans, but each side thinks that the other side is the aliens.
Wow. And
it's just, it's a really interesting episode because you have, what does the soldier, the boots on the ground soldier, do when he realizes he's being lied to?
Yeah.
What can he actually do?
Yeah.
What could have happened if they could have done something Christmas 1914?
What?
The outbreak of World War I?
That could have been what happened?
No, of course it's the French and the Germans, I guess you could say two technical Christian nations. And they're in the trenches, and it's Christmas Eve.
Oh.
And I think they start singing and then calling back and forth, and then they kind of get out of the trenches, exchange gifts, play games.
Yeah, and it was just
celebrate Christmas.
Completely impromptu, unscheduled ceasefire. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it was kind of an expectation, wait, why are we fighting each other? What's actually going on here? Why?
Right. Well, the culture, especially in World War I, the culture around war was so much different. War was a thing you did that was kind of like an economy booster, that was kind of get the crops in and go to war for the summer and then come back. I think there's a lot of time in World War I that people sort of expected war to be a specific thing, and it ended up being something else entirely. People realized, obviously wars in the past had people being terrible to each other, but there was definitely a lot of new things that humanity learned about armed conflict in World War I that we did not consider beforehand.
Yeah.
I don't know, intersecting lines of machine gun fire.
Yeah.
Mustard gas.
Rolling artillery barrages.
Oh my gosh, artillery barrages. Shell shocked. That's a name. That's a thing that people suffered. Shell shocked. Shocked by shells. Anyways, Any other points about this story you thought were interesting?
Yeah, I think
Go ahead.
kind of towards the end, where it's whether or not this idea was completely went with, because I think it was kind of, I don't know if it was kind of ambiguous at the end and how exactly the turn of it being
Right.
going, but the idea that from the get-go, it's this city thing has been like a testing ground
Right.
for the other two nations to, test out ideas.
Yeah,
Right.
how effective certain propaganda methods work. Keeping control of the
Or just
flow of
how
information.
just like how a society would be ordered. Like, let's pretend like no other countries in the world right now were, communist or ever had been communist, except for something like, I don't know, North Korea. And imagine, let's say 50 years before that, they tried to reestablish some new monarch feudalism thing. And then they were isolated. No one really went in or out. But then every, 40 or 50 years, they kind of altered what it was they looked like.
Right.
And yet then you find out that really they're just kind of like a sandbox for, 5 or 6 other nations to kind of sandbox society ideas to see how they play out.
What kind of country would have to exist that would be okay with that? You know what I mean?
I mean, I don't know if that's directly how some things go, but if you look at, I don't know, not to be too conspiratorial, but I know that there's people out there that, play with the economies of different nations, build them up, watch them crash,
Right.
move on to the next one.
And
Kind of use like country economies and well-being as their little plaything.
yeah.
I explained it to someone the other day where it's like, as we would, let's say, watch football for entertainment, to use that, I don't, but people do, right? The normal, blue collar working Joe, they get home. What do they do for entertainment? Well, they turn on football or a TV show, right? Well, the people who make these things and run them and set them, what do they do for entertainment?
Right.
They have to go on a larger scale.
They destabilize third world countries.
Yeah.
Yeah. I suppose it's actually not that crazy to think that
So it's
organizations, people, and maybe even governments would do things like that. I mean, there is not a zero amount of evidence to suggest that the CIA has overthrown governments or at least assisted in it in some way. And in some ways, that kind of, it's like, well, we need to make sure that countries are going to work with America. In some ways, that's kind of like, I don't know what I think about that.
There's a book written by a guy named Umberto Belli, Honduras, and he had cooperated with the CIA and was part of the Contras fighting the communists.
Yeah.
So you have a change of administrations, and all of a sudden they're cut out, and it's like they made their plans based on agreements that were just that whole notion of you're responsible for what you tame.
Right.
And they just left these people hanging,
Right.
So this was, and well, of course, the obvious one, the Shah deposing the Shah of Iran. The Shah had been why it had been, I don't know all the details and what the facts are, but widely reported that the Shah of Iran had been propped up by the CIA as a sovereign nation, to make Iran a sovereign nation to stand against Soviet encroachment into the Middle East.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, it's the same thing. Oh, never mind. I won't go there. Yeah.
I really enjoyed working on the character in the second episode of this story. I had villain's sidekick, and I kind of patterned my Mr. Reynolds after C.S. Lewis. His space trilogy. In Out of the Silent Planet, he had two villains. Lord Weston was clearly the mad scientist villain, and Divine was kind of his sidekick. And then in That Hideous Strength, he has come into title, and so Divine is now known as Lord Feverstone. But he was working with the quasi-government bureaucracy, NICE, NICE, and I can't remember what the National Institute of something. But he introduced that notion of using manipulation. The protagonist guy, Mark Studdock, was this literature professor, and they wanted to get control of Bragdon Wood, which was owned by the college that this Studdock was a part of, because the legend was that was where Merlin was buried, and they wanted to revive Merlin to be, thinking that he would work with them, to get control of England again, and they didn't know, of course, that Merlin was part of the old magic and he would never have cooperated with them. But it's a great story. But the idea of how they would manipulate people to get in to do their dirty work for them, they would say, now, if you come with me to this meeting, you'll be meeting some of the people that are on the inner circle, and they'll assign you duties, and you'll get, do your projects, and there'll be, there is plenty of whiskey and cigars and a lot of camaraderie and everything. And then Feverstone would drop the bomb that, well, these guys are just a bunch of stooges just doing our bidding. But you really want to be on the real inside is the circle within the circle, the where the wheels are really turned, and using flattery and a desire for people to be part of the inside group to get them to be part of their mechanisms for controlling and manipulating people. And I patterned this guy, and I really liked, Levi, that you twigged right to where I was headed, is that, the actual villain was this diabolical system of the secret knowledge, that how the elites are the controllers of the secret knowledge, and that's the way they control the masses.
Yeah.
And I thought that this story had great possibilities, but I've written down a number of these stories, that come to mind, of people who go to great lengths to control others for the purpose of solidifying power.
Yeah, I like the idea, Seth, that you brought up, where it had actually been quite a long time since the Messiah figure.
Yeah.
But everyone was kept in kind of this space of limbo and had believed it had literally just happened a little bit, a couple of years ago. And they were constantly in that place. Another thing this could be, this whole city could be a giant test bed for lots of things. It could be a test bed for medication. It could be a psychological test bed. We could literally have made it where there were hidden cameras and the wall panels moved away. And, this was like a place that governments and people did experiments on people to see how they would react to, that's what you said, to see how they would react to different states of government, but it could be literally everything. Oh, this makes me, it's a downer just thinking about the story.
Well, it was worth doing, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway.
I think the biggest reason why it's a downer is because sometimes it feels like my life is just people saying, I wonder if he can survive doing this. Let's try doing that to him.
Yeah.
Oh,
man.
But we made it through, and I think we made a compelling and interesting idea. Even if it wasn't the most gangbusters idea ever, I think it was still good. Seth, any other ideas, or else I'm going to wrap this up?
No, I think that's about it.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us for this episode of Wait It Gets Better. If you have any questions about this story or any other story that we've made, any concerns, any constructive criticism about the podcast in general, please send me an email at waititgetsbettercast@gmail.com or message me on Twitter at @getsbettercast. We will see you all next week. Thanks, everybody. Bye.